All right, we're almost done with our journey through cell-mediated immunity, and there's only one more cell type to talk about, the regulatory T cells. So we're here in the castle courtyard, and if that ominous pit looks pretty ominous, don't worry, bad things are going to happen. Regulatory T cells aren't quite like either helper or killer T cells. They're CD4 positive like helper T cells, but they're not so kind and friendly. They're regulators, they keep shit in line. They kind of remind us of medieval drill sergeants, helping train up soldiers and yelling a lot along the way. Oh, and by the way, shout out to Christian, who won a sketchy contest and is now inscribed in history forevermore as this drill sergeant. Congrats, Christian, you're famous. So before we dig deeper into how regulatory T cells control the immune system, let's add a 4 strap to this drill sergeant's armor to help you remember that regulatory T cells express CD4. But that's not the only cell surface protein they make. They also express CD25, which is a structural component of the IL-2 receptor, and we'll come back to IL-2 in just a little bit. As their name suggests, regulatory T cells regulate the immune system. They do that by controlling or suppressing the immune response, much like this drill sergeant who's ordering everyone to stop and probably drop and give me 50. So, what's he all upset about? Well, Tregs are responsible for what's called peripheral tolerance, which is a fancy way of saying they eliminate self-reactive T cells that have escaped the thymus. Just like Sarge here is sending this self-reactive T-Knight back to Sparta. This is peripheral tolerance! Sorry, best Gerard Butler I could do. The punishment might seem a little harsh, but their ability to maintain self-tolerance is exactly why regulatory T cells are important in preventing autoimmune disease. Another way that regulatory T cells exert their anti-inflammatory effects is by inhibiting the activation and proliferation of antigen-presenting cells, like B cells, dendritic cells, and macrophages. So we've got some familiar faces, our B Archer, Dendrilox, and Macrophage Kid, cowering in the corner to remind you that regulatory T cells can suppress those APCs. Okay, so I said we were going to come back to IL-2, and I'm keeping my word. And you may actually remember this one if you've seen our sketch on cytotoxic T cells. IL-2, which is released by Th1 cells, directly stimulates the proliferation and differentiation of cytotoxic and helper T cells. It also stimulates regulatory T cells, hence why we have this recurring 2-beaked owl hyping up our drill sergeant to represent IL-2. And remember, we'll use this neon yellow signaling color to represent all the interleukins. We've also got Sergeant Sarge here flipping some cytocoins to decide the fate of the next soldier who gets out of line, and also to remind you of the anti-inflammatory cytokines released by the regulatory T cells. There are 3 that you should keep in mind. First up, TGF-beta, which promotes the development and differentiation of regulatory T cells. Next is IL-10. IL-10 suppresses macrophages and dendritic cells, decreasing MHC2 expression and Th1 cytokine production. And finally, we have IL-35. And yeah, I know, I bet you didn't even know the interleukins went up that high. IL-35 expands the pool of regulatory lymphocytes while also inhibiting macrophages and pro-inflammatory T cells. Okay, so far we've covered the role of regulatory T cells in inhibiting the immune response. But who regulates the regulators? The pro-inflammatory cytokine IL-6 steps in to curb the action of regulatory T cells, much like this wise 6-star general who's ordering our drill sergeant to, tone it down. And remember, when the drill sergeant tones it down, the inflammatory response gets ramped up. There's also an important transcription factor that you should keep in mind as you're thinking about regulatory T cells, and that's FOXP3. So we'll add this 3-tailed fox next to the drill sergeant to help you remember that transcription factor. FOXP3 is responsible for overseeing the development and function of regulatory T cells. So, as you can imagine, this transcription factor is critical to Tregs functioning normally. Mutations in FOXP3 result in a rare autoimmune disorder called IPEX syndrome. So we'll have this bird pecking at the fox to represent IPEX. And by the way, IPEX is an acronym that stands for Immune Dysregulation, Polyendocrinopathy, which is why it's linked to type 2 diabetes in infants, Enteropathy, and X-linked syndrome. IPEX also affects the nails and skin, hence why this bird has pecked away some of the fox's fur, leaving these patchy parts. And with that, we've come to the end of our journey with cell-mediated immunity. Let's quickly go over what we covered. Regulatory T cells suppress the immune response by eliminating self-reactive T cells and inhibiting the activation and proliferation of the antigen-presenting cells. Regulatory T cells express CD4, CD25, and FOXP3. They're stimulated by IL-2, inhibited by IL-6, and they release anti-inflammatory cytokines such as TGF-beta, IL-10, and IL-35. And lastly, just to keep in mind, mutations in FOXP3 are associated with IPEX syndrome. All right, let me give that one more try.
We march to glory or we march to defeat, but we go forward. This is Sketchy.